Well, I must say, I received the news from my producer, Amisha, this morning, and going forward, I'm so happy and proud to address my guest as now Dr. Mwale Henry. Congratulations, Dr. Henry. We have to celebrate these wins. Doctor of Papers, a man who would have put some years, I'm sure, into the studies, and rightfully so, getting the title, and now even the job description in a way got a shift. You're now a leadership executive advisor. So well done, Mwale. Well, Dr. Henry, I'm really happy, and I look forward. Very, very important discussion ahead, Dr. Henry. Welcome, as always, to the program.
Thank you so much, Jason, and good morning to you and your viewers. I'm always excited to have informative conversations with you.
Indeed. We're looking at the topic here, emancipation and resistance, and the We Will Remember theme. Obviously, things got to a kind of sour note for some looking on, but then, you see, politics is such an interesting animal, and it seems to find its way in most things. I mean, life and politics, they work tandem. Your reaction to what transpired downtown in a very historic space. That's where the Emancipation Declaration was read, back in the day. That's a symbolic space, and obviously the minister was giving her address and she was interrupted. And that in itself had a whole tailspin and led to, well, clearly what we anticipate, well, what we kind of reading through the lines now was the Prime Minister's absence at the actual village later on in the afternoon. Just your take, before we get into the whole emancipation and resistance discussion, your reaction to what transpired over the weekend.
Well, we must remember emancipation is not just a celebration of freedom, it's a remembrance of resistance. And it's inevitable, the intertwine between politics and society. The mere fact that, as you alluded, 1838, when the Emancipation Proclamation was read, it was a resistance to a political structure. So for me, it's not surprising where that type of interruption took place before the Minister of Culture and Community Affairs, Community Development, whereby, to her credit, she maintained her poise and, in her words, respected her elders. But the cry that took place was truly a reflection of the wider society and its concerns. And I would call that disturbance our modern day Elmer Francis, whereby the concerns of employment, the concerns of community stability, and the very fabric of our society, the concerns are valid, and it would be remiss of any government, any administration, or anyone who calls themselves a leader or an observer of our society to ignore those cries and to dismiss them as some form of sectarian politics.
But some might say, and what you're saying is spot on. I didn't even look at it through the lens, because yes, a part of that remembrance is also the resistance, the pushing, as it were, against the powers that be. But some might argue time and place.
Well, which other time or which other place? You see, one of the key things of any democratic society is the ability to express oneself. And if we look at, I was listening to your commentary earlier, if we look at the content of the statement I would call this fighter made, the content was spot on. The content had no racial overture. The content had no duration in it. It spoke to the current condition. If you look at just recently CSO's updated figures, first quarter of 2026, over 6,000 jobs have been lost. Last year, you're talking about over 40,000 jobs. So there is a great concern. The Minister of Finance, the Honorable Minister David Tampu, speaks of some of those challenges. So what we heard was clear resistance, and it echoed throughout the country what is required for leaders to have the proper response to such a valid concern.
So let's go now to the afternoon and the absence of our Prime Minister at the village. It's not the first time when she was Prime Minister. First time between 2010 and 2015, there would have been some years of absence. I draw the comparison also to Dr. Rowley's absence at the Diwali Nagar, two different celebrations, one with a religious component, the other one with a more cultural and historic component. However, national events that the eyes of the nation will be looking on, and there will be this expectation of the leader being there to address the masses. Was the Prime Minister's absence poor political calculation?
For me, it's not just about absence, but right now we could say it's an absence of good sense. You see, the greatest threat to our society is not oppression alone. It's this collective amnesia that we tend to practice. You know, I would position that this type of tension has been allowed in some shape or form in our Red House, our parliament. If you would recall, Jason, I believe it was in March of this year, the Prime Minister, the Honorable Prime Minister, made a decision to call herself in a racial derogatory term. Now, that may be her decision, but the Speaker had a responsibility to not allow such a statement to stand in our Hansards and to be a part of our official record. Now, there was objection by the Member of Parliament for San Fernando East, and the Speaker, in my humble view, twisted himself in a pretzel to justify that she was not saying this to someone, but she was describing herself. Now, Jason, I will say that this single allowance of the Prime Minister to speak to herself in such a racial derogatory term, if it's allowed in the Red House, now it's happening in the streets. So this type of tension, which we all know can be the tinderbox for so many other things. So my requirement now is that there should be a clear admission that the Prime Minister herself has heard. We can use many examples of many other leaders who have heard, as you would have alluded to. But it's not too late. This needs to stop. We need to reset. And the country needs to get focused on key matters that are at hand.
Because interestingly, Dr. Henry, the same statement that I refuse to say, it's not a word I grew up in my household hearing. So, and it's something such a small, certain words you don't use. That's a word, strangely enough, culturally, we are so different. In Jamaica, other parts, Grenada, it's used loosely because the East Indian population, there's a minority. People call themselves that. That's their handle on Instagram. Yardman, C word, right? I tell my Jamaican friends, well, I can't tell you that because even Trinidadians who go to study in Mona, when they're called that, it's a culture shock. So seeing the Prime Minister using that as in a post online, the funny thing, I sit in this chair as a media practitioner, I can't even read that post. Imagine my Prime Minister's putting up posts that I cannot read and will not read. I find this to be very bizarre.
And it is. And to your salient point, we have a Prime Minister who is politically experienced, who has a hands-on political mandate. She has been able to defy the political odds, came out of the opposition wilderness. Many would have read her obituary many times over, and now she's in a position that she has fought a brutal election campaign, successfully so. One would have hoped that she would take this mandate and bring forth some type of not just cultural solidarity, political accuracy, but also to lift up the society based on what was promised. Because the chant was, when the UNC wins, everyone wins. But one would hope a graduate of Mona campus, she's aware of these nuances. So it's a decision, and for me, it's a decision that lacks judgment. And my admonition to the wider society is not to buy into this type of rhetoric, but to be laser focused on the people's business, families, jobs, and how do we lift up all of society so that we can have a prosperous TNT.
I saw another statement that went on to almost disregard our Independence Day celebration. It was described as a place for PNM supporters to drink rum, fet, and I'm kind of paraphrasing here. The statement was to drink rum, party, fet, wine, and enjoy freeness from the state. And I'm saying to myself, when did we get to this place of everything being political and a prime minister and a leader using the platform, online platforms to put that kind of rhetoric into the public, on public record. It's really an interesting time we find ourselves in here, Dr. Henry.
Well, it's unforgivable. And I would say the Prime Minister is not the only offendee. I would have observed our opposition leader, in the streets for the emancipation processions, accompanied by her colleagues. And the chant was, "Move Kamala, move, let we pass." So a procession that is designed really to have a reflection on what we require to do as a people and as a society. I would say nothing is wrong with the understanding of your political contender. But the moment requires us to have a much more sobriety in how we reflect on things. So to your point, Jason, it's not the first time we've seen this rewriting of history. We've seen it in the practice of, people have this sense of false equivalency between chattel slavery and indentureship. We see it at UTT in the celebration and the inclusion of Indian culture on the platform of celebrating African Emancipation Day. So this type of rewriting of history, or to your point, not reading the room, it doesn't augur well for not just our history, a proper understanding, a sociological understanding of our society, and more importantly, setting the right tone that would welcome proper development for our country as a whole.
So my question to you, because I live here, you understand the ground. We all understand the ground. And from my interaction, again, I'm not naive. I've been in different environments. I go all over the country. And when I interact with my fellow Trinbagonians, there is a particular understanding. There is this togetherness. Not all the time. It's not perfect. But we work together, we operate. Yes, people will have their own internal corporate politics, regardless of where you work. But the reality is, we tend to function. I just wonder if there's going to be a breaking point, or how could we break this perpetual cycle of them and those and the political dark cloud that's trying to fan a particular flame. I don't want us to get to how some of these places people fight in war, and I don't want to see that for our country. How do we break this mental and this political mindset?
For me, if I reflect on the attempt that Dr. Keith Rowley, then Prime Minister, made by positioning Stuart Young, SC, as Prime Minister, I would say history will reflect on that moment where Dr. Rowley was ahead of the class and probably ahead of the curve culturally and sociologically. Upon him reflecting on the mandate of the People's National Movement, where his constitution talks about a rally for all, his attempt would have been a cultural reset. To your point, Jason, what may be required is that the political parties challenge that type of schema, that cultural schema of a Black party and an Indian party. And probably by challenging that schema and challenging that framework, by its political parties being led by different ethnic composition from the leadership perspective, I think it would push the society to have a different view of each other, and more importantly, change the content of the conversation. So from that perspective, I think as we reflect on our political history, we must be willing to challenge some of the frameworks, the cultural frameworks, the racial frameworks, and in doing so, we would be able to create a new society. So Jason, I remember a time during our political conversation, I made a prediction concerning then the US presidential election. And I'll tell you this, it will not be surprising if the UNC attempts to do what Dr. Rowley pushed forward to the nation, to probably have a different view or persons to lead the UNC, and that ethnic composition, which we all know would be a disturbance to our political landscape. And if that occurs, the People's National Movement would be asking a question if they are still culturally relevant to this type of shift. And that's happening. It's happening subtly. It's happening methodologically in terms of the strategy. And probably that disturbance is desperately needed for our society.
Interesting. We find even other ethnic groups within the country, because Trinidad and Tobago, as we know, a rainbow nation, so many would have come here and made their home. We find ourselves looking at folks who might not necessarily be in the headlines. They more or less work, keep their head down and go about their business. And we're talking here about the Syrian community and even the local white community. I saw a minister, a sitting junior minister, refer to a former minister who is now an opposition MP's family as white trash. Those words were said in a post, and I found that to be rather distasteful. If we don't like injustice, we can't accept it at all, whether it's white, black, brown, blue, right? So what's your take on the current environment as it pertains to even those who might not necessarily be in the conversation? Because I'm sure they too will have their grievances, even though people might feel, okay, they in the corner and they're not really putting up their hand and making no noise. Your take on just that particular part of the conversation?
Well, that's a decision. Every generation must decide whether to inherit courage or inherit silence. And if you're talking about other groups of our society where we believe they aren't part of the general conversation, because we try to describe Trinidad, even in our statements, we say we're of multi-ethnic, various races, we're a rainbow nation, but we have this polar conversation between East Indians and Africans. And you have other aspects of the society sitting on and listening. If we continue this tone-deaf conversation of understanding how integrated our society is, if you talk to the average person, they could tell you their stories of friends, they could tell you, the experiences by the Chinese man shop, this Hadid experience that you just described. Many persons could speak about their personal encounter and experience with him, and who aren't Syrian. So it's inescapable that our stories are intertwined and interdependent as a society, and any attempts to create some form of subdivision or exclusion, or if other parts of the society is not susceptible to any type of fallout from other parts of our society, is a myth. So I truly believe what is required now is that society, wider society, needs to have the courage, and leaders need to have the courage. Our intellectuals need to have the courage, because there's too much spin doctrine on our cultural conversations, even at the intellectual levels, where people are, as I alluded before from the speaker, they are intellectually twisting themselves into a pretzel to try and justify things that have no historical backing, no historical referencing. So that courage, for me, I hope today that many, along the spectrum, from professionals to intellectuals to those in, the regular everyday man, have the courage to speak with clarity, with respect, and with human dignity, and to correct the wrongs whenever they appear.
Dr. Mwale Henry, sincere thanks as always. Great conversation this morning. We'll touch base soon.
Thank you so much, Jason. All the best to you and to your viewers.
Yeah, same to you. That's Dr. Henry, now a leadership executive advisor. So he also is moving up and stepping into a new particular role and function. And he's also a sociologist too. So kudos to Dr. Henry. So last week we had the TNT Automotive Dealers Association president and vice president. They went to a meeting with the minister, and they're back with me today to give the update on this hybrid situation. Visham and Rondell Fields, they're up next.